Welcome to Get Even. Get Even is the podcast where Even founders Ellen and Nora, that's me, sit down with incredible women who've been there, done that in the world of business. Get Even is your backstage pass to their lived experience. You'll hear raw insights, personal stories, and the realities of success. Whether you're looking for inspiration, practical advice, or a peek behind the curtain of what it really takes to thrive, this podcast is for women ready to go further. It's time to get even. Welcome back to the Get Even podcast. I'm Dr. Nora Koslowski, co-founder of Even, and today I'm joined by Madeline Oldfield. My conversation with Madeline was fascinating. Her career story is anything but linear, and that's exactly why I found it so powerful. Madeline Oldfield has worn many different hats. She's been a lawyer, a transformation leader, and most recently, head of data measurement and analytics at Google. Her story is a masterclass in not self-selecting out. She talks about her early career experiences where she unexpectedly led an IT rollout in her 20s, through to more recently navigating Google's privacy sandbox and leading technical teams where she wasn't the technical expert. This episode is for anyone who's ever felt the fear of stepping into a role that perhaps they weren't ready or qualified for, and anyone who's wondered how to translate complex technical work into impact. You'll love Madeline's insights on courage, on data literacy, and on career pivots. I hope you enjoy this conversation. A huge welcome, Madeline. I'm so delighted to have you on the Get Even podcast today.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Nora. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
I can't wait to have this conversation with you about data practices and really some of your areas of expertise, which cross over into areas like the law, they cross into privacy, they cross into stakeholder and project management, and then also into the world of tech. So it's sure going to be a fascinating conversation. But I want to begin with asking you about the career that you've had and some of the career shifts that you have made. So most recently, you were heading up data analytics at Google. As I said, you've been in the law, you've been in change management, project management. Can you just chat us through your logic behind the career shifts and how your career story hangs together? And also, I'd really love to understand how that unique legal background that you have, how that background informs your approach to tech and analytics.
Oh, I love it. Okay, and this is a multi-part question, so I feel like I might have to get some prompts as we go. But look, I would love to say that this turbulent and exciting career path started off with a legitimate plan. It absolutely did not. I think the closest thing I had to a plan was find the road less traveled. And I think I adopted that really early in my career to make unexpected choices and do unexpected things. And I think by doing that and not necessarily, forcing myself down a path, it just meant that I took a lot of pressure off myself. And so I have always loved, solving problems. I've always loved working with people. I've always loved looking at things that are really hairy and impossible to solve and trying to put some structure and order to it. Which sounds, oh yeah, okay, there's maybe some method behind the madness, which is what has ended me in a career in later years towards sort of privacy, data, measurement, analytics. But for sure, when I started, it wasn't necessarily the case. But yeah, look, so you asked me a couple of the themes that led it through. I was very fortunate early in my career to find a love of projects and transformation. And I tell people this story because I think sometimes inspiration from a career, beginning a career or thinking about a career path comes from very unexpected sources. And this particular source happened when, believe it or not, I was working in marketing and in a call center, customer service and marketing. And one day I was on the call center shift at a place called Interflora, which is, if you know them, they send flowers worldwide. And this is in the late 90s. And the CIO at the time marches downstairs to the contact center, looks around, and he says, "You, come with me. And I was like, oh gosh, what's going on here? He's like, right, so you're the youngest person in the room. You must know something about computers. I need our florist to get off the green screen mainframes and onto the internet. And I look around and I'm like, I don't know what the internet is, but yeah, sure, okay, absolutely. I mean, I had thought maybe I would need to learn what the internet was. It was the 90s after all, and so I embarked on an IT degree, but only to complement my commerce degree. So I was all about the commerce, never about the IT. And I was fortunate enough to spend a summer. And I should mention the negotiation. So it went something like this. He said, okay, so I need to get the florist off mainframe green screens onto the internet. And he's like, how long do you need? And I was like, well, I need to go back to uni in Feb, so I don't know, 3 months. He's like, great, how many people? And I looked at him and I was like, I don't know, 50? He's like, you can have 10. I said, I'll take 30. He's like, deal. So I had 30 people reporting to me for 3 months of a summer, and we nailed it.
How old were you?
Oh, gosh, I was like early 20s probably by then. So, but did I have any real world experience? Absolutely not. Did I know my power button from my reset button on the desktop in the computer room? Not really. And I think a lot of it just came from a bit of confidence. I learned pretty quickly that I wasn't allowed to self-select out of something. I had to give it a go, and it was only when I couldn't do it was I allowed to say, okay, maybe I can't do this. But I wasn't allowed to give up before I tried. And that has always, I think, served me well as a bit of a personal philosophy, which is why when people are like, how did you end up in blah, blah, blah? I sort of say, oh, maybe overconfidence and maybe the right skills. Who knows? Combination of both potentially. But I think there's something in that, I guess, in that, what do you need to lead a team through uncertainty and change? You need to listen, and you need to be authentic, and you need to problem solve on the fly, and you need to find inspiration from unexpected sources when people are tired. Maybe they need a moving box full of chocolates. I had a manager at IBM once come in with a moving box full of chocolates to get us through a long defect and coding weekend one year. Others who have done amazing things like take us on a golfing trip to sort of inspire, everyone coming together and being in the outdoors, versus like some more recent things at Google where maybe we play, electronic darts and just have a good laugh with teammates. So yeah, I think over the years, like keeping some of those themes consistent about how to lead people through difficult times and build the energy yourself is really critical in having a career that takes you to really unexpected places.
Thank you for sharing some of those stories. They're wonderful. And I love the themes of kind of unexpected moments or unexpected decisions. Can you share, were there some other key decision or inflection points in your career then, especially thinking about sort of some of the more recent career stages that you've been in?
Absolutely. So, oh gosh, where to begin? I think it's funny, isn't it? Like when you first start off with certain things, I've always had it in my mind that I needed a trade. And that sounds strange in a corporate context. So, I don't have a legitimate trade. Unfortunately, I can't build anything or heal anybody, but I do believe even as a corporate practitioner to have a trade. And so often when I'm making career decisions, I'm asking myself, am I pursuing and improving a core skill that I've got? At the time, it was around project management. And ironically, from this one project many, many years ago, actually led me to appreciate projects. And then within projects, I thought, okay, I need an IT specialty. I am the world's worst coder. I get distracted and forget syntax and, was never one to write particularly clean code. But I was really good at the logic. And so I worked out pretty quickly that I was able to bring people together and coach and break things because my logic was not necessarily there. So I became quite a good tester, actually. So that was my tech trade originally. And by being a good tester, you're able to really get under the hood of things and see things a bit differently. And so over the years, what I wanted to do was make decisions that would improve that trade so that even if I was in a leadership position, and that happened during my IBM days, for example, even when I left, I knew that I would need to go back and actually go back on the tools. And this has happened time and time again. So I might do a project or a stint for a couple of years as the program director or program leader. And then I might go back and do a gig in change management, or I might do another gig in business analysis or run the project management office versus running the actual delivery. And I honestly believe that's been critical to keeping my finger on the pulse. But it also helps me learn traits, whether we want to admit it or not, sometimes about what not to do. So you don't always get managed and led by great people. Often you do, but that's not always the case. And sometimes as an observer in those moments, I've learnt how to become a better manager by learning what not to do as much as what to do. And I think, historically having, whether it's a project management or change management trade and really great tools in my toolkit has helped me coach and mentor teams in more practical ways. So that's been, I guess, my strategy up until about, oh gosh, I'm going to say about a year ago, maybe a few years ago. So then I went to Google, and again, taking a very similar approach by using my trade of project delivery and project management. So I started in Google Cloud. And then I realized, I was like, gosh, I've been doing projects for 20 years now. I'd won a few awards in this domain and discipline, and I loved it. And I was like, but what do I do next? I'm always someone that, has the equivalent of a travel bug, but in corporate context. And so I'm always looking to like move and travel around and try new things and have new experiences and meet new people. And so I realized that I had kind of achieved everything I wanted to in a project management and program delivery context. And there's always more to learn, of course, but I wanted something different. And so an opportunity came up to do sort of partnerships and business development, which I hadn't really done in a formal way. I'd always had elements of stakeholder management and change management in the work I was doing previously in transformation, but this was incredible. So this was on a project called Privacy Sandbox. I was able to use my law skills. I was able to use my tech skills. I was able to use also my change and business understanding of operating models to educate Australia and New Zealand about an initiative Google was running with Chrome browser to look to transition away from cookies to a more privacy-safe internet. And that was super cool because effectively it made me learn about the plumbing, if you will, of the internet and how, at least from a privacy and private identity model, it all hangs together. But I was so far out of my depth in terms of understanding what partnerships actually was. It just made me realize I had so much more to learn. And fortunately, I sort of embraced it and went to privacy conferences and improved my understanding of, some of the old world HTML and some of the privacy elements of back-end technical skills. And it was almost like learning a new language, picking up, I don't know, Japanese when you've only ever studied French or Italian. Some of the principles are the same, but actually fundamentally it's quite different. And so I just approached it like I would learning a new language, that I didn't need to understand every word. I just kind of let it wash over me. And then over time I could build up. I could say basic phrases. I'd have to write it down and do my research first, parrot it back to the poor developer community who would say, oh yeah, actually, maybe that makes sense. And I mentioned that I started my career in testing in tech. So I was always good at breaking things and finding the logic and seeing the gaps in the ecosystem that perhaps others might not have. And I think even if what I had to say wasn't necessarily at the core and heart of it, I think I generated some interesting conversations over time. And then also my background in understanding the customer built a really interesting lens to how we approached privacy and cookies in Australia and New Zealand when it came to Chrome browser, because it was much more, I think, customer centric than other approaches. And again, I think given our current environment and context with the privacy reforms that are happening in Australia, and also, all the work that we're doing with the consumer data right and digital identity, I think has really helped me understand where Australia is moving from a data privacy perspective. So it's a bit of a roundabout way to explain how I guess I got there and I guess embraced that learning of a new skill like you would a new language. But truth be told, the last year was probably the most exciting and the most stressful and the scariest career-wise, because for the first time in 20 years, Nora, I was not the domain expert. And leading a team where you're not the domain expert was really scary for me. So I was fortunate to head up data measurement analytics, looking after all the major Victorian clients. I'm based out of Victoria, and interestingly, my team, who have a mixed background of data science and developers and measurement experts, they really know their stuff. And I'm sure you can appreciate people at Google, when they're technical folks at Google and data folks at Google, when I say they know their stuff, it's a little bit even more elevated than certainly some of the projects I had been on. So they didn't need my help in writing great SQL scripts or Python scripts. What was interesting and perhaps again a transferable skill elsewhere was trying to, I guess, educate stakeholders about the value that they can bring, and being able to translate their work into something that contextually was going to add value to the context, whether it's our clients or internal projects we were running. And I think, I don't know if that fear ever fully leaves you of not necessarily being the domain expert, but it's also probably my greatest advantage because I was able to look at problems very differently, and I wasn't coming up with the same old that I guess other peers or others in that same field would be talking about, because again, you sort of get into that familiar habit, which I was probably doing in the project management context, and not necessarily wanting to disrupt what works and what's a really solid way of going forward, and particularly in a time where the economic climate is pretty conservative. So I felt really fortunate to have that role in the past year, and I think the learning and accelerated learning, I should say, baptism of fire has been pretty awesome. And that's obviously led to my latest career pivot, and I'm sure we can, share with your wonderful community here. But I've just, as of last week, actually, so it's only been a week in, I've just accepted a full-time PhD at Monash, looking at redesigning, reimagining digital justice, and looking at dispute resolution and online hearing. So that's going to be a cool one, and certainly one where we're going to have to talk about data and privacy implications. So it'll be interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's a whole other level. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think there's so much in that. And one thing I really want to pick up on is something that I think is relevant for a lot of our community, which is your most recent move, or actually the year of you being in charge of a team or a division where you were not the domain expert. And I think that's a really common one as you advance in your leadership career. And I think that can hold a lot of us back because, the more you take on in terms of functional leadership, the more teams you assemble underneath yourself as a leader, the less likely it is that you'll actually understand the detail of the work being done, or you'll be able to actually to get back on the tools yourself. And I certainly know that myself, that you actually don't, at a certain level, you don't really understand everything that happens in your team anymore. And that can be a bit scary.
You do.
Yeah.
Isn't it interesting? But yeah,
Yeah.
I feel what you're saying very deeply, obviously, having just experienced it in the last year. So yeah.
Exactly. And it is a bit weird because you're reporting up on your team's efforts, their outputs, their issues, and you're also providing guidance to your team. So it's an interesting position to be in. But for those members of the Even community who are actually thinking about broadening their remit, how can you think through that, and what's your advice? So deepening from what you're already sharing with us, how would you advise our members to think through that broadening of their leadership and the further just elevating out of the detail?
Look, in the sort of general terms on that, and then perhaps if you wouldn't mind, Nora, we can also touch on the data elements, because that's a critical new, if it's not already, it's probably an existing capability that needs to sit in your toolkit around data literacy and the ability to use that. But I guess just generally, one of the best things I think, more senior leaders or leaders who are looking, I guess, to stand out and help their team stand out, is forming great partnerships. For me, knowing that you could be aligned with someone with a similar interest where the two skill sets can complement one another, for me is critical. Again, whether it was my work at Google, but also previously, so working in transformation projects, I worked for some of the largest banks, and some of the best results I ever had was finding peers, a similar sort of level, and trying to find out what they were working on and seeing if there was anything that we could do that could align. A story comes to mind working at one of the big banks. I was working legal ops for NAB, actually, and this is a public project, so happy to talk about it. We won the Good Design Award for service design across the Australian Service Design Award winner for service excellence, I think they called it. Sorry if I get this wrong. I haven't looked at my own LinkedIn profile for a while, but I think it's something like that. Anyway, I went and fortunately had some relationships built with product, and I was, again, legal ops. So in the legal team, I worked with product, and I also brought in some service designers. And between the three of us, we actually reimagined a process around credit card terms and conditions. Normally, product and legal, there's a little bit of a history there, but we managed to find a way to bring the two teams together, as well as the tech teams, as well as service design, to reorientate what we were doing from a legal perspective to be more customer centric, rewriting the terms and conditions, and actually making them well understood. And believe it or not, we wrote them from the perspective of the customer, not the bank. So again, I tell this story because sometimes having those partnerships and being able to partner with others helped me achieve my very narrow remit, which was these terms and conditions are really confusing, and turned it into something that was way bigger than anything we could have done by ourselves. So I really encourage your audience to think laterally and find those partnerships. I mean, truth be told, it takes time. It was built on what I hope is, I don't know if she's watching today, but my old product and my service design partners, I'm sure they would say there's several years of history of working together, and I think that having that trust will help. But so too is just working and putting yourself out there and meeting new people and seeing if they want to partner with you on something. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. If you haven't tried it, see if that works.
I'll jump in there with a comment, actually, because this is really relevant. Last week, we had a discussion on our platform about power. And one of the bits that came up in the conversation was actually a strategy to increase your own power as a leader was exactly looking at who can you partner with, who has adjacent objectives, or who can help you. Sometimes, especially if you're in a transformation role, as an example, people can get sick of you kind of agitating for the same thing over and over again. So who's the partner who can actually make the same argument and help you to strengthen? So I just wanted to say that's super aligned with what we're talking about.
Yeah. And I obviously have worked in a data context, yes, at Google, but also prior to Google, I worked on a massive transformation program for state government in Victoria. We brought together a whole bunch of data sets from, I think it was maybe 12 odd different business units across government, which if anyone has worked in government knows that is the impossible ask, getting government to shake hands and share data. And the reason I think that the partnerships element is so critical is sometimes, even if you're given that remit, one of my go-to strategies is, even if I have the remit, it doesn't mean that I go with the information to try and solve it for everyone. Very rarely in this day and age do I go out, sort of solo, alone, trying to solve for the world. I really, really, really focus on who has influence, and I particularly focus on the person I think that has the most to lose from the transformation, and see whether or not there is a way to help them get at the front of the transformation so that they can equally be seen as a leader in this. And the reason I brought that government project up is because there was one particular group that had a lot to lose, right? They were doing really well. They had built a great platform themselves, and we were asking them to give that up to serve this greater purpose. But for the fact that we managed to convince them to be on side and to take the reins and actually be the leaders of this thing, that was a way for us to align. So even though their platform, I guess, was switching off and they were transitioning, they became the thought leaders and therefore the go-to people, and kept their relevance and that power dynamic across the departments. Again, I share that as a both a caution, but also maybe as a strategy. Like, sometimes your most frustrating stakeholders can actually be your ticket to a really great outcome. And that's happened a couple of times in my career, so much so that, even people who you think at the time, oh gosh, never going to catch up with them again, we just never mesh. Some of those people are actually some of my greatest confidence now, because I respect that we had differences of opinions to get to the same outcome in our own way. And I really have learnt a lot from listening to them over the years. Not saying I would do things their way, and certainly not saying they would do things my way, but having people who challenge you is as important as having supporters, and having that respectful sort of dissonance is really critical.
Amazing. Thank you. I think that's super helpful in terms of how you navigate your stakeholders. And I think just not focusing on what's comfortable or what's the easy relationship, but really focusing on who's got the most to lose. I think that's actually super useful advice, and it's a great strategy.
It's never a straight line, and it's 2 step forwards, 1 step back. But again, doing what you can in that space is, it can be a game changer. And it certainly worked for me over the years. I hope it helps someone.
Takes patience.
Yeah.
I think I do want to get more into the data element of it, which I think is another element that probably does require patience. But I am quite curious to, when you're transforming a business from the inside out, I'd love to understand, what's your approach to understanding sort of where is the data at? Is it being collected in different ways across the business? How does it help you to understand and define the problem that the business is trying to solve? And what's your starting point there? I mean, this is quite broad, but let's start broad before we go into more specifics.
Look, believe it or not, I think I have a different strategy depending on industry. And the reason I do that is because data is a bit like a rabbit hole. Everything and nothing is data. And it's a bit like, it's almost like the term change management. Like everything is change and nothing is change. And so the reason I often have a slightly different approach depending on the industry is because every industry has a hook that motivates them. So generally speaking, in banking, for example, financial services, the hook for me has always been risk. And why risk? Because banks are heavily regulated. They care about risk. And risk is a very strong motivator, particularly for boards who understand their obligations as fiduciary, their fiduciary duties. So, risk in that context, if you're an ASX listed company, is often a really great and slightly unexpected motivator. Versus something like telco. So I've worked in telco. Margins are really low. And so commercial is a really strong motivator, the money. And so when I was able to work on projects that, could have gone either way, or looking at data in that context, I would focus on the financials because I knew that would get me the attention. Versus government. And what is it in government that gets the attention? Citizen experience. Staying out of the media sometimes is another really strong motivator. And so looking for data that would either, enhance or in the media's case, sort of avoid that eventuality. But generally speaking, every industry will have its hook, its context that makes it uniquely theirs. And so one of the strategies I use is, what's the hook for whatever I'm working in that's going to actually get me the attention? And if I can start my data search based on those big, gnarly problems and work backwards from that, that tends to get me focused. That tends to get my team motivated around purpose. And it tends to give our data narrative a slightly stronger pull than someone who's just trying to tackle everything, clean up data, talk governance. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. And if you have an organization that is willing to invest in that, by all means, like don't feel like you need to change your change tact and change your strategy. But if you're feeling really overwhelmed and you have an industry and you know what their hook is, try and work out how to link your data journey to that need. So financial services clients, as an example, really great because they have to document a lot of their processes, whether it's CPS 230 or other regulation that, Sarbanes-Oxley, even back in the day. There's a lot of hidden data if you talk to risk teams about processes, about risk, and about controls of those processes, which will help you understand all of the layers and where the different data might sit and who the process owners are. Right? Now, again, I'm talking about these are for more mature organizations, but if you're working for a huge bank and it's hard to navigate, where do you start? And it's not that often that people in risk and privacy and even legal, have people come and say, hey, any chance you've got these artifacts? And so I often say they're a great team to partner with because they really want to be helpful, certainly in my experience, but they're often overworked. And so for someone to reuse their collateral in a new and innovative way could be really great. And the framing around that data narrative is risk mitigation. So that has been a really strong hook for me. The other obvious place is in IT. But we all know, well, I don't know if we all know this, maybe your organizations are different, but probably the busiest team who will be holding the most tickets, who will be blocked from every angle from an agile delivery platform delivery experience is usually your data analytics and used to be the BI team back in the day, but basically the data teams who are trying to find data integration. And so a couple of different ideas there if you're thinking about how you might get into and start to partner and source different data. One is speak to the project teams. Have a look at what in-flight projects are running, because often they're really well funded and often they already have access to some of the data and tools that you might need. And if you can find a way to partner and they get a use case out for what they're trying to do, again, that partnership dynamic that we spoke about earlier, it's a really great way to almost like piggyback off something that's already got momentum. So don't forget in-flight project teams even before you go to your business as usual operational teams, because it could be a really good way to build in requests and have it, being driven by a strategic imperative. But my best go-to, and I've obviously found that working where I've worked in recent years at Google, but also happened in other organisations I'd worked in and partnered with when I was on the client side. I really make use of my partners and their data. So one of the things I don't think we do enough of in corporate Australia is really understanding that when we have commercial contracts that are in place with most partners, and it could be your cloud provider, it might be also your marketing provider, could be your CRM provider, they also have access to really great information and insights. Maybe, yes, it might be related to just your organization, but it might also be industry level data. And so if you can go and have a chat to them, often they have, again, if you're a large corporate, you will often have access to consultants, or they might call them customer success leads, functional consultants, these sorts of folks whose job it is to help you better use their products and services. So if it's a CRM, maybe using Salesforce, for example, or HubSpot, or that it's highly likely they will have people there and willing to help and wanting to help, and may not have the business sponsor to help them do that. So go and have a chat to, and I'm not going to call them suppliers. They're not vendors. They're not suppliers. They become your partners. And I think I've been very fortunate to have great partners over the years where I've had to leverage what they're doing to get the insights that I need to build my business case. I'm really fortunate. I work with a group called ThoughtWorks over the years, and they do a great tech radar, which has really helped, I think, from an innovation lens, looking at some of the new technology that's coming through. But also, even when I worked in government, whether it was partnering with cloud providers, Microsoft, AWS, Google Cloud, there were a lot of, and I'm going to call it freebies, but there were a lot of times, even at the banks, even at NAB, where we leaned on those partners to give us, extra firepower to help get a project over the line. Even law firms, believe it or not, often have these innovation and support arms. And we were very fortunate to work with HSF and KWM, two massive law firms in the innovation space. And that was some of that award-winning projects that I mentioned earlier. So I strongly encourage your community to think beyond your organisation and think about, the partner ecosystem and how you can use data in that way. I certainly know if you're one of the large scale customers working with Google, and your marketing team probably already has that relationship, there's some incredible insights that you can get from an industry perspective, which obviously is dependent on the size of your organization and the support that you get. But it always surprised me that many clients didn't even realize that was an option. And so I always tell people, because I'm like, it's not a secret, and if it can help get you what you need to influence that business case, to look at building a new feature or function, or to partner with someone with the skills that maybe has done it before that can give you those insights, please use them. And often they'll be there to help. And often, if by doing that, it's almost like you sort of have like a pre-established relationship. So if your idea does get over the line, they're ready to hit the ground running, so you can deliver faster and get results faster. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. So you're really relying on both external and internal partnerships with different teams. But I also think what was really helpful is just your starting point of really thinking about what are the different hooks that motivate an industry, the starting point of what are the big problems within the specific organization then that need to be solved. But what about further down the track? So let's say you've done all of that. What about where you're then actually presenting data back as an insight, and you're trying to motivate specific action with internal stakeholders or with decision makers? What are your tips for that stage of work?
I got to be honest, there's a couple of patterns that come out of that with me. The first is, we almost need names for them, Nora. What do we call it? The first is the sunny day, and everything's great, and you present your insights, and people are like, oh, Maddie, thank you so much. That's exactly the insight we needed to make this decision. We had no idea. So glad you brought that to our attention. We're going to take action, and it's going to be great. And that's wonderful. I would say that's happened to me maybe 5 or 10% of every experience that I've had when I've presented this, when I've presented data insights back. And please appreciate as well, like I come from a project world where often, and technology projects large scale, so often when I'm presenting information, it's, not always the best news. And so it's very, very unlikely that people just take the information at face value, which I guess leads me to my second category. Then I think you find sort of two types of, in this way. Those stakeholders that get angry and try and fight you on the data. And their strategies, I
You
think,
don't like what the data tells you?
don't believe it, don't like it, maybe try and discredit the findings, discredit the method, discredit the legitimacy of what you are saying, so that they can push whatever agenda they need to. Usually it's to maintain a status quo, but not always. They might have a different strategy that they're trying to implement, but it's being aware of those techniques and holding yourself um, in a calm way, because you're prepared for it and you know how to respond in that moment to shift that power balance, I think, back to what you're saying. So as an example, and I say this often, if you're working with data teams, data folks, we're certainly in my experience, we're sort of the messenger half the time, because even though it flows through us and we can see it and we can visualize it, we can surface it, we're not necessarily the ones owning it. We don't necessarily own the risk, the process, the P&L. And so it struck me time and time again, and this has happened across 20 years of my career, where you present something to someone and they fight you for it, or they, argue against it. And often there's been a couple of times, and I probably have said it earlier in my career, it's like, hold on, don't shoot the messenger here. But I feel like in that moment, if you're finding yourself saying that or something similar to that, you've lost the power dynamic. And so try and avoid, if you can, getting to that point. And the way in which I do that, and certainly being much more focused on now because of the new data measurement analytics techniques that are out there, it means that there are many paths to get the answer. People think that even though it's data, it must be 100% accurate. That is not necessarily the case. And so you have to be comfortable with articulating ambiguity, and you have to build, I believe, credibility with stakeholders by, before you even get started, talking through where that ambiguity exists, what you do to mitigate it, and talking people through the method that you're going to use to run the extractions, the pros and cons, whether you call it an options paper around data methodology, whether you call it a risk assessment. There's lots of terms you can use for it, but the intention is you need to ensure that your stakeholders understand there's many ways you can get there. You and the teams that are working on this are going to suggest path whatever, path A, path B, path C, pros and cons of this, but the outcome will be something that will give people information where they should feel 80% confident about the decision, or 90%, or 99%. If you ever say 100%, that will obviously erode the credibility. Data can never, ever, ever be 100%, just like software can never, ever, ever be defect free. It doesn't work that way. So I think it's about understanding what gives people a level of confidence. And then you might also find that your decision makers are happy to take a steer at 60%. So you don't need to build everything that you think. We've also seen that time and time again, whereby there's overinvestment in data platforms, governance, data owners, and there's this full, I say infrastructure, but in the broader sense, there's this full kind of conglomerate of data governance, which maybe is not necessarily for the decision. And so really sounding stakeholders out early about the outcome that they're chasing and the level of confidence is one. And I give them a spectrum, and I used to color code it back in the day of, where do you want to sit? 60 to 80%, is that good enough? Or does it need to be higher? So I used to talk a lot about that from project perspective, for example, with project data. And then there's also those who, even if they hear and they don't argue with you, they don't take action. So the times that has happened to me is probably the most common.
And why do you think that is?
Look, I think it depends on the environment and kind of the economic climate and context. I think, when things are going not so well, and I think people just are very, very risk adverse. I think the economic climate, or if you're in a government context, it might be the political climate at the time. People don't want to take risks. And it's not just about your findings or my findings. It's about everything else that's going on. Like, yes, you might have a burning platform quite literally, but what we don't necessarily have visibility of is the fact that they have 17 other burning platforms. And yours is kind of a contained fire. And you seem pretty capable, Nora. So I'm not that worried about it. Yeah, it's not great, but so too are the 15 other things I'm trying to deal with. And so I think in those moments as well, if you can frame your insights into why this and why now, that's critical for building legitimacy for your ideas and what you want to do and presenting findings back. Again, the other thing that really helps with that is demonstrating that you've exhausted all of those internal channels and partnerships to get that alignment, and demonstrating why, for whatever's remaining, that you still need extra funding or extra resources or extra sponsorship, whatever it happens to be. But I just wanted to kind of highlight those three patterns because I do believe it's critical to helping. It's been critical when I worked out that pattern to help me manage my own emotions when I'm relaying information, particularly uncomfortable information, to executive or boards or steering committees or whatever it happens to be. Just knowing that you could get all of those reactions in the same vein and making sure that you're prepared with being able to defend your findings without getting defensive, that's a really critical bit. And that is where that methodology element that I mentioned and the data confidence level comes in, because it gives people wiggle room to say, look, it sounds like you want a confidence higher than 80%. I'll bring everybody back to when we discussed it to be 80. Happy to do 85. That's going to take another 3 months and blah, blah, blah resources as we articulated at the start. We can do that. And but this is the other thing. I might just leave you and your community with this as another thought provoker. The other question I try and ask stakeholders, and it's not always easy to ask it, so you might need to pick your moments, but if you can, it's really important. Ask them a hypothetical of what are you going to do with this information? What are you going to do with it? It turns out, and we give you a result that's in this range, for example. What do you do? We give it to you in this range. What do you do? In this range, what do you do? Because one of the things I've found is if I can get my stakeholders thinking through their next best step before I've presented the results, then I'm not fighting that battle of getting them to do something. But if I'm presenting my results and I'm getting them to do something, it's overwhelming. And again, getting back to that comment about why they don't take action, if everyone's already conservative enough and the economic climate is saying, just steady the ship and safe pair of hands, etc., etc. If we haven't thought through those elements, I think it can be a real miss. It doesn't cost us anything, and it may be questions that you need to raise one-on-one with stakeholders, and you may need to prompt it. But I really strongly recommend that you think about how they might answer. And you might have to say, because I've done some industry research on this, and I found similar organisations or this other industry, it was faced with this, the outcome was in this band, it took these steps. And you tell everyone, I'm not asking anybody to make a decision. I'm not asking anybody to take action, but I just want to make sure that with everything else you've got going on, before we embark down this path of extra effort, energy, and taking resources away, that we're not going to do it and then it ends. We're very clear that if we're going to do it, there could be a couple of paths here. Are we going to be brave enough to go down one of these paths? Again, don't need to make a decision, but it'll give you a sense of whether or not you should continue the initiative or the ask or the drive early, and to see if you truly have sponsorship from your stakeholders. Because if they turn around and say, oh, look, let's cross that bridge if we come to it, like, we could, but it's a lot of effort to cross that bridge. So anyway, they're just some nice thought starters that I think, if I could have my time again earlier in my career, I would have asked that question a lot and saved everybody a lot of aggravation, because there's a lot more projects that should be stopped or ended rather than continued.
Beautiful. I love those questions. And I think it takes a certain, I guess, wisdom and experience to get to having the confidence to ask those questions up front rather than sort of just do what's being asked of you. And I think there's another really important element that you're alluding to in your advice there, which is around the sponsorship or the ownership of, who owns the actions, because otherwise your team, if you're leading a data team, could be going down, different lines of investigation forever without any action happening. So I think that's really important as well.
I don't know if this gives everybody confidence or if this is like a bit of a commiseration for everybody in the data space. But I was really fortunate. I was in like a workshop the other week with a lot of heads of data and CDOs across Melbourne, across Vic, and interestingly, one of the key themes that did come up time and time again is that sponsorship element is critical, so that people don't expect the data team to be both finding the insight and actioning the insight and having to take ownership for everything end to end. And so, again, I don't think your community's alone if you're feeling that, experiencing that. And I know how hard it is to get out of that. But the reality is that you've got a team that have very specific set of skills, and you want them to stay as objective as you can within an organization. That's what builds I believe that data teams credibility with its stakeholders. And if you're getting too involved in the actions, even if it sort of is kind of maybe related to data, even the data cleanup and the data ownership, then you might need to look at some alternatives. Otherwise, you end up running the entire organization, right? Because everything's about data, which has come full circle from the start of that part of the conversation we spoke about.
Wow, I think that's also really useful advice. Wow. Okay, I'm conscious we are coming to the end of our time together today, but there's one question that I do ask every guest on the Get Even podcast, which is around career advice, good or bad. So I'd love to hear whether you've got any great career advice that was given to you at some point that you want to share with our community on Even, or it could be that, some of our examples have been terrible career advice that our Even experts have chosen to ignore.
That's so good. That's so good. Oh, look, I think I gave you my best advice early when we first started, Nora. So maybe it's a nice way to finish and just wrap. But yeah, just reminding everybody not to self-select. You're not allowed, and I would say this to the community: you're not allowed to say you can't do it until you've tried it. Sometimes tried it twice, and then you still can't do it. Because I think if I had waited and told myself that I couldn't do it or that I didn't have the skills, I wouldn't have done half the things. And whether that saying of all of my favorite Insta t-shirts is true, have the confidence of a mediocre 40-year-old white man. Like, there's something in that, right? Like there's something in having the confidence to try something. And when I say try it, I mean try it and maybe try it twice to really make sure that you can't do it, because generally speaking, you probably can. And the worst career advice, and I would particularly say this as people get more and more senior, is once you're at a certain level that you've made it, and to get comfortable. Whatever you do, and I think, this AI era that we're now entering and beyond, I think that ability to constantly challenge yourself and get out of the comfort zone and use those partnerships well is going to be critical in order to stay relevant. And I think I've seen this, I guess, watching some of my favorite mentors, most of them women, get to these really incredible highs and lead huge teams and be in the C-suite. It sort of struck me just how fast that time goes, and how quickly it can turn. And so I think making sure that you have really built something that is like a really robust career that can kind of weather the storm is really important. And I think that only comes from staying constantly curious and trying new things and having a few side hustles and projects, but mainly building great relationships with people who know you, who are there for you, and you also being there for them. So maybe that's the third piece of advice. Maybe give back to the community 10% more than you'll ever get from it. And then this way we leave it in a better place than when we found it.
Wow. Thank you. I actually wrote down your earlier quote, just the one about don't self-select out. For me, it was like, yeah, that's exactly right. Because so many different leadership experiences that, many, many members of our community have had, they wouldn't have happened had, somebody not just kind of gently nudged you into something. And I love that very early example that you had at Interflora.
Yeah.
But I think it's so important for us not to put up our own barriers when
Absolutely.
it's, there's already the structural barriers or there's enough of them. Yeah. So,
I mean, I tell people this: at 38 and a half weeks pregnant, the CEO of VCAT, also a woman, but she's an incredible mentor even now, and she was willing to hire me for what became the best project of my life. And I was going to say, oh no, I can't do it because I literally couldn't walk the 500 meters from the train station to the place to the VCAT offices where we were catching up because I was not well and I was like waddling my way through. And I sort of said, look, I just physically I can't make it. And she's like, well, how about we have coffee at the train, right next to the train station? And I think, I was like, why would you want to hire me? This is what she goes, because you're the right person for the job. And I just think, again, if I had self-selected in that moment, we wouldn't have won, Project of the Year with the Project Management Institute. I would not be doing this PhD. Hopefully we're going to go and improve access to justice for, beyond Victoria, but definitely for Victorians. And I think there's a lot of unknown great that can happen beyond that first yes, that when you set those wheels in motion that you just don't ever know will come to fruition. But, you just need to trust that you're putting yourself out there and doing new things. So hopefully people are feeling a bit more inspired, and there's fewer self-selections at the end of this. What do you reckon, Nora? Is that a fair?
I reckon so. And I can just echo yours. So for me, it was I started one of my roles. It was an executive role. I started at 31 weeks pregnant, and I almost self-selected out. And it was my husband who actually said, obviously they've contacted you for a reason. And it was the hiring manager, the CEO, who said, is she the right person for the job? Yes or no. That's the deciding factor, not the pregnancy. But it's like we could just so easily, I think, we could just say, oh, I'm like not ready for it, not the right time.
Not the right time. Yeah. And then
so many reasons.
So many. And truth be told, a lot of incredible women who, if we're being honest, are much better, project directors than I'll ever be. And they have made the choice to self-select and for the right reasons at the time. And I just wonder whether or not, if they had made different decisions, would have been much easier for me. I'd have amazing people to report to by now. But I do wonder, and I love that we can still hear these stories of people who are like, no, she's the right person for the job. You are there for a reason, and why not own it? Because if you don't do things your way, like it sort of undermines the process anyway. So you might as well do it your way. And give it a go.
I love it. Thank you. I'm Dr. Nora Koslowski, co-founder of Even, where our mission is to accelerate women's economic potential. Check out even-careers.com to learn how we support women and business to get even.